a woman in the middle of the delivery room, squeezing the edges of the stretcher tightly, preparing to give birth to her baby, when she noticed that there was something strange about her doctor, who also seemed to move in a very strange way. Very scared, she tried to warn everyone what was happening, but the pain of her contractions barely allowed her to speak. And that's when something unthinkable happened. And suddenly a chorus of screams began to be heard in that hospital, announcing an event that would forever mark the life of this poor woman. Natives of a small town in the south of Argentina, Mark and Alexandra were a young couple of florists who live by selling arrangements and renting an annex to their house to the hundreds of tourists who came to visit throughout the year. After learning that in less than 9 months they become parents, a great joy enveloped them, and they were worried about offering the best to their baby. Although at that time, births still used to be carried out at home and very few moments went to hospitals, they decided to take control from the beginning and start saving money so that their child could be brought into the world in a private medical center by the hands of experts. Since, in his opinion, this would be the best, they strictly attended consultations and followed the instructions given by their doctor to the letter in order to carry the pregnancy in the best possible way. As soon as he found out about her condition, Mark asked his wife to stop working, and he began to take care of his business and attended the tourists so that she could be calm and not have to worry about anything. Likewise, he made sure to buy her everything she needed and always took a few hours out of the day to go to their house to see how she was doing and keep her company, even if it was just a few minutes. Alexandra was so happy that everything was going so well that she could never have imagined that a devastating tragedy would change everything completely. One afternoon, when the snow had already covered the entire town, Mark went out to make a delivery of a flower arrangement several kilometers from home. His wife found it strange that he was late in returning, so instead of going to bed, she sat down to wait for him in the armchair, where she finally fell asleep until someone knocked hard on her door. At dawn, it was 2 firefighters who, with their helmets in their hands, gave her the tragic news that her husband had lost control of the vehicle due to the snow and was not able to survive the strong impact that his car received. Alexandra couldn't believe her ears. The world under her feet suddenly seemed to collapse, and with a broken heart, she began to cry, wondering what will become of her life and her son's life without her beloved husband. Despite her great pain, the poor woman, motivated by the most valuable thing that the love of her life had left her, that beautiful being that grew in her womb, Alexandra became convinced that she should move on, so she started working at the flower shop again. With the little she had, she bought a wheelbarrow that she dragged down the street to go herself to deliver her orders and thus earn a little more money. Well, the truth is that she'd been left full of debts, and if she wanted to be able to cover the cost of giving birth in that hospital, she had to save even more. This is how Alexandra worked tirelessly until the last day of her pregnancy, in which her water broke when she was in the middle of the street. And luckily, a friend of hers, who was a taxi driver, was nearby and took her immediately to the hospital. Already in the waiting room, with all the anguish that a new mother suffers, Alexandra found herself completely alone in the world, since the only person she had then was the son who was about to come out of her womb. At that moment, 2 nurses approached her to inform her that the doctor who had controlled her case until then could not treat her due to a family matter, so it would be another doctor who would carry out the process. This was a man she'd never seen before, since apparently he'd only been working there for a few weeks. This made her feel uncomfortable, so much so that she was about to leave. But the nurses asked her to keep her calm and begin to speak wonders of the doctor already in the delivery room. Tormented by contractions, the poor woman had to wait almost an hour. That happy man appeared, and when he finally did, despite how desperate she was already, she only had to look at him to feel that something very strange was happening. His movements were quite clumsy, and he seemed not to hear anything she or the nurses said to him, very nonchalantly, if not even checking her out. The man ordered Alexandra to push something that puzzled her a bit, but she held out so long that she had no choice but to obey him. Feeling her chair inside her, the poor girl pushed and pushed, but her efforts seemed futile. And it was then that she, exhausted, looked at that man up and down and realized something that left her horrified. The doctor was wearing absolutely nothing under his gown. In addition, his eyes were red and his gaze was lost, which immediately made her think that he was under the influence of some substance. Alarmed, she tried to warn everyone of what was happening, but no one paid any attention to her, and they only asked her to calm down and keep pushing. Very scared, she had no choice but to do so. It was then that her baby's head began to appear, and suddenly all the nurses began to scream. And one of them, seeing that the doctor did not react, pushed him out of the way and then pushed the creature out of their mother's womb, while a great scandal was heard in the corridor. This caused Alexandria to lose consciousness of herself. When she finally woke up, her baby was no longer inside her, but he was not next to her either. So she began to call the nurses to bring him to her, but none paid attention to her. A lady who was in charge of cleaning, seeing her so desperate, approached her and explained that apparently her son had the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck and was suffocating. So they had to take him urgently to the operating room to make him an urgent surgical operation. And now the little boy was in intensive care. Apparently, he had been without oxygen for a long time while they waited for the other doctor. I don't understand why they should have called someone else if he was on there, the lady told her. With eyes full of tears, Alexandra got up from the bed and walked around the hospital in search of her son. When the nurses saw her, they immediately ran to stop her and took her back to her room. I'm sorry to tell you that your son was born with a rare syndrome that affected his brain, so it's likely that when he grows up, he will not be able to take care of himself and may not even walk. As she kept explaining to them to let her see her baby, Alexandra didn't believe a single word. So very upset, she began to shout that this was a lie and it was all the fault of that doctor, who could not even stand up. And even so, they allowed him to treat her. Being in those conditions, not knowing how to respond, those women told her to shut up and stop making false accusations. But seeing that she was willing to continue talking, she was injected with a sedative. The next day, they threw her out into the street with her poor child, who was still very delicate in her arms. Although luckily, and thanks to her perseverance, she was finally able to get her baby the medical attention he needed after a fight of more than a decade for justice to be done. And both the doctor and the hospital were sanctioned for that unforgivable negligence that forever marked her life and that of her son. Because they all covered their backs and she was a woman humble, while the owner of the hospital billionaire was unable to win the case. Now 20 years have passed since that incident, and despite the fact that her beloved Elliot is already a man, due to the serious damage he suffered due to a lack of oxygen, his mind is still like that of a child. He was never able to learn to speak or walk without the support of crutches, while Alexandra continues to fight for everyone to know her story. And somehow she ends up getting justice. Day after day, she's confessed to those who approach her at the flower stand to talk about what happened, that her greatest wish is that God gave her enough life to continue taking care of her son, and that the day she has to leave, take them both. Well, she would never forgive herself for leaving alone in a world where there's no one else to take care of him. It's unforgivable that there are professionals so foolish that they don't understand the size of the responsibility they carry on their shoulders. Above all, well, it is the life of another living being that they have in their hands, and it's something that must be taken with the greatest of commitments. In the same way, it's unfortunate that in this world, money is worth more than justice. That's why we must always be attentive to whom we trust, even the least, and no matter what, raise our voices in the face of injustice. Well, if we all shout together, the world will not be able to ignore us. Well, folks, that's the end of this incredible story.